Another question?
Charles Trillingham, class of 2003. Trust. You began your career in an era when the loudest voices in journalism, people across America trusted them. Nowadays, it tends to be the loudest voices in America are those that get there first, not necessarily those that get it right first. Do you think there's an issue now with the public, and maybe the reason why there's less numbers tuning in and less hard journalism, because there's a lack of trust and maybe a lack of ability to regain that trust?
Look, what you're referring to, sort of that period when you had Walter Cronkite and Chet Huntley and David Brinkley and people like that, that will never, ever return. It can't. You know, in the 1960s, you had a situation where, as I said before, you only had 3 networks. And the notion of Americans sort of gathering around the electronic hearth at 6:30 every evening and saying, all right, let's see what Walter has to say. Let's see what Chet and David have to say. Those days are gone, because now you've got 1,000 Walters and Chets and Davids. Not 1,000, you've got 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. Everybody is his own Chet and David. You know, information is bombarding us at all hours of the day and night. I mean, I did a panel with a very famous woman who runs has her own blog. We were actually in Africa. And while the panel was in process, she was texting. And I sort of stopped and I said, what are you texting? She said, I'm texting what's going on in the panel. I said, how can you possibly be participating in a panel if what you're doing is sort of transcribing it as we're going along? You know, it doesn't make any sense. Let's wait and see what the panel says before you start texting. You know, I was being argumentative, which is my nature. You know, the most important thing about journalism is not the gathering of facts. It is the sifting of facts. It is separating the wheat from the chaff, the trivial from the important, providing a sense of context, putting it into some kind of, you know, historical framework. Historical can be a month. You know, it can be, you know, just pointing out that somebody who's saying this today said something that was, you know, totally different 3 weeks ago. Constantly acting as sort of global stenographers of what is going on at this instance really is not journalism. That is not what journalism is about.
So I take it you don't tweet?
No.
Any other questions? I was teasing you at the top of the show about stealing the cadence from Nightline. There's also an echo in there of Murrow's "This Is London," of course.
Oh yeah. Do you have time for a quick story?
Sure.
1959, I was 19 years old. I was a junior at Syracuse University, and I managed to get a visa to the Soviet Union, which back in those days was hard to get. And I did a little bit of reporting while I was over there and put together a radio documentary. And I began the radio documentary in Red Square in front of Lenin's tomb at midnight. And I had the microphone out so that when the guard came by with their creaking leather boots on the cobblestones, it was the creaking of the boots and the chiming of the bells of St. Basil's in Red Square. And I began my report by saying, I'm Edward J. Koppel, and this is Moscow. You know, as a not just a fan, a devotee of Edward R. Murrow's, I thought that was the only way you could begin. And I went through this sort of critical moment in my life when I had to decide whether to be Edward J. Koppel or just Ted Koppel. And something told me that the middle initial era was over. And so I became Ted rather than Edward J. but I really wanted to be Edward J.
Well, I think any of us, I remember the first time I did a sign-off from London, saying CBS News London, and this little shiver went down my spine.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see a little bit of yourself, a little bit of Murrow in yourself?
Only in the sense that I get the, I never met Murrow, so I didn't know him. And to the degree that it's not a question of seeing something of him in me, except to the degree that clearly his journalism had an impact directly on me and indirectly on me through, for example, a man who was my mentor, another middle initial guy, Howard K. Smith, who was one of Murrow's boys, and who was a scholar, an historian, an inordinately decent and morally courageous man. So to the degree that Murrow's influence sort of seeped in through other people like that, clearly, yes.
We preach objectivity in journalism, obviously, but Murrow overtly took on McCarthy.
Yeah.
Is there room for that kind of aggressive journalism today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this notion, my least favorite kind of television reporting is three man-in-the-street interviews, one for, one against, and one, well, I haven't really made up my mind yet.
He said, she said journalism.
Exactly. But I mean, it isn't even the he said, she said, because there's no debate between them. It's just you have served the gods of objectivity by putting one of each out there. There is not necessarily a middle ground to be found between good and evil. Sometimes something is patently wrong, patently bad. And I think it is the journalist's responsibility to point to that when he or she sees it. And not everything in journalism is a question of taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mixing it up together and adding a couple of spicy adjectives and then serving it up as journalism.
But it's a lot harder to cut through black and white and go to gray.
Well, it is, but
to explain it to the audience.
I think, in point of fact, the object of good journalism is to cut through all of that other stuff and get to a conclusion. Not a conclusion based on opinion, but a conclusion that is demonstrably accurate because it is based on facts. Now, because of the nature of journalism, sometimes, most of the time, you can't do that within an hour or two, or even a day or two. Sometimes it takes days, weeks, months of journalism to produce that kind of a conclusion. But I think this idea that everything has to be sort of bland, middle of the road is also wrong. You know, it does. What I object to is the partisanship. You know, sometimes a position held by someone who is an extreme conservative or an extreme liberal may still have the advantage of being absolutely correct.
Is there room for a Murrow today in the fragmented media market?
Oh, look, I mean, one of the things I didn't realize until I'd been in this business for quite a while is that for all that we idolize Murrow today, he was effectively forced out by CBS.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, you know, is there room today? Hell, there wasn't
somebody to get forced out.
There wasn't even room back then. Same with Howard K. Smith. Howard K. Smith was forced out of CBS. CBS was universally acknowledged to be, CBS News was the jewel in the crown. But the fact of the matter is that Bill Paley did some very cowardly things. And the way he treated Howard K. Smith was one of them. Howard K. Smith looked at some of what had happened in Birmingham, Alabama, and came to the conclusion that the Ku Klux Klan was very much involved and that the city fathers knew about it. And the Birmingham affiliate called up Bill Paley and said, if you don't get him to retract, we're dropping our CBS affiliation. And Paley called Howard in and demanded that he do it, and Howard refused, and that was the end of Howard K. Smith's career at CBS. Things are obviously compressed in the telling of that story. But he ended up at ABC because CBS got rid of him, or at least Howard wouldn't stay under the terms that they required. So has there been shallowness and cowardice in network television, you know, before the current era? Oh, yeah.
Well, Murrow complained about the state of the industry, Newt Minow's vast wasteland speech.
Yeah.
We keep hearing it over and over. It's cyclical. We have strength in journalism. It goes away, it comes back. I mean, will it come back? Do you have hope?
Look, what's the name of that great comedian? Someone here is going to help me, you know, who did the one ringy-dingy, two ringy-dingy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I forget her name. Lily Tomlin.
Lily Tomlin.
Yeah.
Lily Tomlin has this great line that I love. Lily Tomlin said at one time, no matter how cynical I get, I can never keep up. That's kind of how I find, you know, I mean, we look back now with longing at the bad old days that we just described, because bad as they were, we still had bureaus all around the world in those days. You know, CBS could still afford to keep a guy in Cairo. CBS doesn't have a correspondent in Cairo today. ABC, when I was a young foreign correspondent, combat correspondent in Vietnam, I had 25 or 30 foreign correspondent colleagues, not in Vietnam, but around the world. These days, I think ABC has 4 or 5. And yet the world is a more complex, more dangerous place today than it was even back then in the 60s. So, you know, bad as things may have been, they're looking pretty good in the rearview mirror.
And on that note, Ted Koppel, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks to those of you in the audience and those of you at home. It's been a pleasure having you here for the Murrow Interview. I'm Lawrence Pintak.
Good night, and good luck.